at a bigger scale, like a global scale. A comprehensive analysis of red list data from marine fauna of the Eastern Tropical Pacific provides the first ever data set to examine the extinction risk of marine species at a scale of a major biogeographical region. The tropical Eastern Pacific is a unique and dynamic region separated from adjacent tropical marine areas by the Central American Isthmus in the east and the world's deepest and broadest deep water barrier in the west. So this region extends from south of southern Baja California throughout the Gulf of California and southwards to Peru. And this region also includes 5 oceanic islands and archipelagos. So the Galapagos, Malpilo Island, Cocos, Clipperton, and Revillagigedo Islands are part of the tropical Eastern Pacific. So, Eastern Tropical Pacific assessments were conducted in 10 taxonomically themed workshops between 2005 and 2008 in collaboration with more than 200 scientific experts, and including many members of the species specialist groups and red list authorities of IUCN. Data from these assessments are now available publicly online on the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species website. So prior to these assessments conducted in 2005, there were 226 red list data available for sea turtles, seabirds, and marine mammals. There are now 1,342 new marine red list assessments of species found in the tropical Eastern Pacific, including all of the bony fishes, sharks and rays, reef-building corals, mangroves, and seagrasses. So a total of 1,642 species have now been evaluated under the categories and criteria of the IUCN Red List. So of the 1,642 marine species assessed in the region, 12% or 197 species are listed as threatened, meaning that they qualify for listing under one of the threatened categories: vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered. We can see from this graph that sea turtles have the highest proportion of threatened species, with all 5 of the species listed in the threatened category. Next up on a high proportion of threatened species are the habitat-forming groups, such as the mangroves, seagrasses, and the reef-building corals. Mangroves have 40% of species found in the tropical Eastern Pacific listed in threatened categories, 25% of seagrasses, and 17% of reef-building corals are listed as threatened. Bony fishes have a relatively low proportion of threatened species, about 9%, whereas sharks and rays have a higher threat proportion, with about 15% or 27 out of the 180 species that occur in the region. So, spatial analysis of the data prior to 2005, so data of seabirds, marine mammals, and sea turtles, show a concentration of threatened populations in the offshore regions and off the coast of Peru. So these are shown in the darker blue. Sorry. When we incorporated the new assessments, 1,342 species, we show that there is a different story now. The concentration of threatened populations have now moved from offshore to nearshore areas, to coastal regions. And these threatened populations are impacted by varying threats in the region. And we'll touch upon that in a little bit. So what can we do with this type of information? Well, one can conduct an MPA gap analysis to show the percentage of the species range or threatened populations that are currently overlapping with marine protected areas. So unfortunately, there's a little bit of lapse in the screen. So we can see that the Galapagos obviously has a high number of threatened species, but are also protected by a number of marine reserves. This type of analysis can highlight priority areas where conservation efforts need to be concentrated. So for example, Clipperton Island, I can't reach it, but it's right there. Clipperton Island has a high proportion of threatened species. However, we can show from this type of analysis that there are no marine reserves at present time. So with this type of data, we can show the governments and conservation managers that, hey, this is a priority area, and this should be a priority for the region. Marine reserves should be created here. Thank you. Okay. All right. So spatial analysis of species distributions can not only identify where the threatened populations are found, but can also pinpoint the specific threats and the location of those threats. We show that different areas of the Coral Triangle, Gulf of California, Costa Rican and Panamanian coasts, and the oceanic islands have varying threats that are affecting the populations in the region. So the Gulf of California is affected primarily by overfishing, destructive fishing practices, the loss of critical habitat areas from coastal development, the expansion of shrimp fisheries, and the diversion of the Colorado River for agriculture in the United States. The Costa Rican and Panamanian coasts, on the other hand, are primarily impacted by habitat modification and degradation and mangrove extraction. So in this area, the Mesoamerican region, is that right? Oh, Costa Rican and Panamanian coast, there is considerable overlap in the threatened populations of bony fishes and habitat-forming groups, such as mangroves. Of the 800 bony fishes found in the region, more than 100% spend a portion of their life history in mangrove areas. So, for example, this catfish, sea catfish, currently listed as vulnerable, is known only from less than 5 estuarine and mangrove locations in Panama. And this species is heavily impacted by pollution, coastal development, habitat modification, and overfishing. So this is one of the more interesting findings in the study, in that we show that one would not think that a species like the sea catfish, the lowly sea catfish, not iconic in any regard, could be significantly impacted by these types of threats in the region. And so moving on, the oceanic island endemics are impacted by a combination of anthropogenic and climate-induced threats. So one of the other things that we want to highlight in this study is the presence of data-deficient species. Data-deficient does not mean that a species is not threatened. It only means that there is not enough data to adequately quantify the impacts of those threats to the species or to the population. Approximately 45% of marine mammals and sharks and rays in the tropical Eastern Pacific are listed as data deficient, as are 16% of bony fishes. So for the bony fishes, almost half of those data deficient species are known to be highly impacted by the threat of fishing, whether targeted or incidental fishing. And we want to highlight this species, Epinephelus quenquefishata, which is the Pacific Goliath grouper. This species has been recently recognized as a distinct species from the Atlantic Goliath grouper. And why we want to highlight this species is because it's heavily impacted by fishing. It's a large fish, very desirable, and we know that there have been severe population declines for the populations of this species in the region. However, there was not enough data at the time of the assessment to adequately quantify the population declines. So this is one species that may warrant a listing of higher threat category in the future as more information becomes available. So in conclusion, comprehensive species level assessments can better refine conservation priorities. A better understanding of the threats impacting populations and the factors causing heightened extinction risks can help mitigate threats and develop measures for effective conservation action. Finally, as it is important to focus conservation and management efforts on economically and ecologically important species, it's also important to persist in building a strong knowledge base to counter the effects of biodiversity loss in this rapidly changing world. So, thanks very much. I think we have time for one question. Yes.
I was just wondering what the deal was with some of the algae in the Galapagos. I thought there was a hint that some of them might actually be extinct, some of the former dominants in the community there.
Okay.
I was there when they did those assessments, and there are quite a few where they suspect that some of the endemic algae are actually extinct. You know, it's very difficult to establish that a species has gone extinct, but they're doing yearly surveys of the algae in the Galapagos, and some of these haven't shown up in 30 years, and so they're not sure, but they think that the increased severity and frequency of the enzo events have, in some cases, actually caused several species to go extinct.
All right, we'll then move on to the next presentation. Bruce?
We have here our logo. We set out to survey the threat status of the 61 species of tunas and billfishes. We also did the 2 species of dolphin fishes. This is the first time a major commercially exploited group has been thoroughly surveyed using red list criteria. And I must say there's differences of opinion between some fishery biologists and some conservation-oriented people about definitions of red list categories or terms that fishery scientists use, like overfishing of various sorts. Anyhow, about 50 scientists from 13 different countries over a period of several years met in a series of workshops. Many species of tunas and billfishes are widespread, so it was necessary to do this regionally. So we had an Eastern Pacific meeting in Lima, we had an Indo-Pacific meeting in Taiwan, we had an Atlantic meeting in Brasilia, and then we met at Fort Lauderdale to have an integrated attempt to stitch the various regional assessments together for widespread species. And so we found that there are a number of data deficient species. Almost 2/3 of the total number are okay, that is least concern, and there's about 11 or 12% that are threatened. Push this. So let's look here at a similar graph or figure that Kent used, and you see that the threat status for those primary producers is all pretty high. But then you see this group of fishes in the middle here, angelfishes, butterfly fishes, parrotfishes, most grasses, have a relatively low number of species at high threat, even though they live in coral reefs, which we said have a high level. This is primarily because most of these species are not highly exploited. There's no fisheries for most of them. If we look at groupers, on the other hand, it goes up a little higher because several species of grouper are heavily fished, and so some of those are endangered. Then we look over at billfishes and tunas, and we find, similar to groupers, a pretty high level. And this, of course, is because there are major fisheries directed at tunas, and there's a major bycatch of billfishes by tuna exploitation. Then, in comparison, we look at sharks and rays, and they're higher than tunas, even though there's no directed fishery for most of them. They're heavily exploited indirectly as bycatch. Now, what are the reasons for the difference in this fluctuations that Kent alluded to? And one of the differences is in life history strategies. What we have with sharks and rays are large species, many of them large, that reproduce relatively slowly. If we have some of the tunas are widespread and lay lots of eggs, and so they have the possibility of repopulating more rapidly. So there's a life history element involved. There's also the possibility that since tunas and billfishes are under management by regional fishery management agencies, whereas most sharks and rays are not, that management has to at least some extent helped keep those numbers down. But to return to life history again, you notice over here marine mammals and sea turtles with very high levels. These are also species that are long-lived and reproduce very slowly. So there's a definite life history characteristic that you can see by comparing the levels of threat of the various species. Now, let's look specifically at some of the tunas and billfishes. What we've plotted here is generation length, and the red list criteria examine populations at intervals of 3 generation lengths. Fishes like anchovies and plupiids reproduce very rapidly, so 3 generation might only be 6 or 8 years. But some of the tunas, generation length may be 10, 12 years, so 3 generations is 30 or 40 years. So there's a big difference.